Good afternoon, everyone. All right. Well, welcome to the Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory. My name's Aaron Espinoza, and I am the Library and Observatory Director, as well as the Executive Director of the Writers Festival. So welcome, everyone. If I could ask everyone to please silence your phones. We're going to get started. I'll get you going in just a moment here, but we're going to talk about a few programs coming up. Please know, we are in our extreme season. You know that. You're here in the Coachella Valley. We know what March is. If you are a donor, if you are a Rancho Mirage resident, and you are coming to our premiere event, please make sure you are here about 20 minutes before the program. You see how many people we had to let not come in today? From my estimation, it was well over 100. Okay? So, if you are not going to make it in that time frame, please do not fret. You can live stream it on our website or on your phone. So I want you all here. We only have so much capacity, and I don't want you to be deterred from like the group that was out here right now, and they're now having to head home. So we talk about live streaming. You can go onto our Rancho Mirage Writers Festival YouTube page and see every video we have ever done. That includes all of our Writers series this year. It also includes many of the events that happened on 2023 at the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival. So if you did not get a ticket to the 2023 festival, or even if you did and you missed a session, or if you really want to hear another session come back, you can come back on here, and we have hundreds of videos on our website. So please join us. The Rancho Mirage Writers Series is an opportunity for the Writers Festival to give back to our community. We have already welcomed over 20 authors since last October, and we will have 4 more this month after today. On Tuesday, March 7th, we will welcome Hearst Castle's official historian for over 20 years, Victoria Kanzner. She will discuss her new book, Julia Morgan, an intimate biography of the trailblazing architect. Next Thursday, March 9th, we will welcome journalist and author James Churchill to discuss his book, Secret City, The Hidden History of Gay Washington, and he will be in conversation with New York Times reporter Adam Nagorny. March 21st, Tuesday, March 21st, we will have political strategist, Liz Smith, discussing her eye-popping, entertaining memoir, Any Given Tuesday, a political love story. And to finish out our Writers Series season, on Tuesday, March 28th, we will welcome music industry executive Nabil Ayers to discuss his memoir, My Life in the Sunshine, about his journey to connect with his musician father. At the conclusion of our March programming, the Writers Series will have given away over 5,000 books at a value of $85,000 to our community. We are extremely proud of the Writers Series, and for those of you that were here before the COVID pandemic, we were really trying to get this program started. We were doing 4, 6 a year, and then Jamie, our founder, and we'll introduce him in just a moment, he got bored, and so we had 25. Excuse me. The Writers Series would not be possible without the support of our amazing angels for our Writers Festival. So for those of you that are angels in our first few rows, thank you for all of your support. I've already mentioned Jamie, but I would like to give him a huge round of applause for his creation, his vision, and helping continue to give back to our community. So thank you, Jamie. We would like to thank our newest sponsor and for the sponsors for our upcoming Writers Series events. Jordan Snitzer and the support of the Harold and Arlene Snitzer Care Foundation are serving as our main sponsor for the Writers Series moving forward. So thank you, Jordan. I know you're not here, but thank you so much for all of your support. We are only able to subsidize 200 books per event. We know that there's a lot more people in this room. So if you did not get a book, our partners, Follett Bookstore, is in the back, and they will be selling books after the event. After the lecture, we will have a book signing right up here at the front podium. So those of you that want to meet Catherine, talk with Catherine, get her autograph, please line up against this wall. We'll get everybody out of the facility, and then we'll get you moving through, and it moves very quickly. So please just be a little patient with us. To today's program, Catherine Grace Katz is a writer and a historian from Chicago. She graduated from Harvard in 2023 with a BA in history and received her MPhil in modern European history from Christ College, University of Cambridge in 2014, where she wrote her dissertation on the origins of modern counterintelligence practices. After graduating, Catherine worked in finance in New York City before a fortuitous visit to a bookstore in the lobby of her office in Manhattan led her to return to history and writing. She is currently in her third year of her JD at Harvard Law School. Take that into thought real quick. Third year at Harvard Law School. When did she have time to write this book? Please welcome to the stage, author of her first book, Daughters of Yalta, Catherine Grace Katz.
Hello. And thank you, Aaron, for the very, very warm introduction. And thank you so much to all of you for being here today. This is a real treat for me to get out of the Boston winter for a little bit, enjoy some sunshine. But first, want to say thank you to Jamie for the opportunity to be here and for such an incredible festival and series and just the remarkable support from the community, and also to Debbie for helping negotiate all the complications of travel and coming from Boston. And it's just been so much fun to get to know you. And thank you so much to Jordan and all of the angels who make events like this possible. It is truly so heartening to see such support from communities coming together in support of writers and literature, and it just makes me so happy to be here, and I'm just thrilled to have the opportunity to join all of you. I'm not the only one who's enjoyed some brief sojourns to Southern California. Winston Churchill came to, not quite here, but nearby in Hollywood in 1929, where he visited with Charlie Chaplin while on a great tour of the United States, and Chaplin was at the time making city lights. So it's a little behind-the-scenes photo. And similarly, his daughter Sarah enjoyed some time in Southern California and lived in Malibu while she was an actress. And this is a painting that she made, clearly very, very talented, which I was lucky enough to find for sale at an antique store. And it was a really beautiful place that she captured, and certainly relevant to today. FDR also visited nearby with his daughter Anna, who had come down from Seattle where she was living. It looks like they're enjoying a very sunny day, not unlike today. And I hear that yesterday's rain was about the most rain that this area has had in several years. I hope I wasn't the thing that brought it here, but you know, it's sunny today, so we'll take that. I love to start with this photograph that is one of the very famous pictures from the Second World War, and one of the three that we have of Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, the big three all together. And they are gathered in the courtyard of Levadia Palace at the Yalta Conference with their military advisors behind them. And what I think is so striking about this photograph that you've probably seen on the cover of books or in history textbooks is the expression on each of their faces. They look very tired, they look frustrated, quite exhausted, and that's not surprising after a half a decade spent at war. But even less surprising given what they've all come to Yalta to discuss. At this point in the war, it's February 1945, the Battle of the Bulge has just ended, and it looks like the end of the war in Europe will finally be in sight. The defeat of Nazi Germany is imminent, and will probably be over sometime in the late spring or early summer. And so now, the race is on to see which of the Allied armies will be the first to liberate Berlin. And with the end of the war and liberation of Berlin brings pressing questions about what to do with Germany once the war is over. Should Germany be allowed to remain one nation, or should it be broken up into a group of smaller states in hopes they can't rise up as a belligerent for a third time in half a century? Also incredibly important to the future of Europe, and especially to Winston Churchill, is the future of Poland. Britain went to war in defense of Polish sovereignty at the very beginning, and the Polish government has been in exile in London ever since, and Churchill does not want to return home and look his Polish colleagues in the eye and tell them they were not able to secure the very thing they went to war to defend in the first place. Stalin, meanwhile, has some other ideas when it comes to Poland. Like the czars before him, he is paranoid about security on his weak western border. There is no natural barrier that protects the Soviet Union, and the pathway of invasion going back to the Napoleonic era has been the flatlands of Poland and Ukraine. And he wants to make sure that when the war is over, after all the sacrifices of the Red Army, that they're going to have friendly neighbors on their borders, with a government in Poland that's going to be sympathetic to the Kremlin. Roosevelt, meanwhile, is a little bit more focused on the Pacific, where the war has not advanced quite as far. Iwo Jima has not yet happened. They don't know if the atomic bomb will be an option. And so he's looking at the potential need for a ground invasion of the Japanese home islands, which could lead to the deaths of 200,000 American soldiers. He wants to save as many American lives as possible, and the way he envisions doing this is by bringing the Soviet Union into the fight against Japan in exchange for certain territorial concessions that Stalin has long had his eye on. Also incredibly important to Roosevelt are thoughts in the longer-term future as they are intertwined with his legacy. He wants to succeed where Woodrow Wilson failed at the end of World War I with the League of Nations by creating an organization dedicated to securing international peace. Perhaps not eternal peace, as he's realistic enough to recognize that that's unlikely, but at least peace in Europe for 50 years, which he believes is an attainable goal. He also believes this organization of United Nations will be the very thing to draw the Soviet Union into the international community once the war is over and the common enemy has been defeated. And he sees this as his lasting legacy of the world. But what I think also is very striking when you look at the exhaustion on their faces is the idea of just what it took to get to Yalta. And this is something that I had not really considered before starting to work on this book. At this point in the war, Stalin recognizes that he holds more cards than do his allies. And if they want to meet, they're going to have to come to him. He is paranoid about security and refuses to leave the security apparatus of his own borders. He's also terrified of flying. He does not want to admit this, so he pretends that his doctors have advised him it's bad for his health to fly. Meanwhile, the irony is that Franklin Roosevelt is incredibly ill, dying, in fact, of congestive heart failure, and yet he agrees to make this arduous journey. Churchill will have to fly first 1,300 miles to Malta, where he'll rendezvous with FDR, but very tragically on the way to the conference, a plane carrying members of the Foreign Office delegation that has been specifically briefed for this conference crashes off the coast of Italy, and a number of these experts are killed, which really casts a shadow over the conference for the British. Roosevelt, meanwhile, is making a week-long journey across the Atlantic Ocean where they're still sighting enemy U-boats. This is very, very dangerous, and once they meet in Malta, they then have to fly another 1,400 miles over enemy-occupied islands where there remain anti-aircraft units which have shot up the tail of one of the advance planes before they finally land in the Crimea, landing at an airfield that is dangerously short for the kinds of planes that they're flying. And then they have to drive another 6 hours over battle-scarred roads, sometimes at no more than 20 miles an hour, until they finally arrive at Levadia Palace. Levadia Palace was once the summer home of Tsar Nicholas II and his family, and it really was a family retreat away from the pressures of court life, where he and his children would swim, ride horses, play tennis. The Tsarina would sell her own needlework at the local bazaar to raise money for charity. But of course, all of this changed with the Russian Revolution in 1917, when the Romanov family was brutally murdered, and the Soviets nationalized his summer palace as a home for favored Soviet workers needing rest and relaxation. Levadia Palace changed hands once again with the outbreak of war as the Nazis pushed into the Crimea, and they used this as their Crimean headquarters. By the time of the Yalta Conference, the Nazis had been pushed out several months earlier, and the Soviets have a mere 3 weeks from the time that the three Allied delegations agreed, this is where they're going to have the conference, to turn a ransacked villa into the site of one of the most important meetings of the 20th century. On the way out, the Nazis stripped the palace of everything that they could carry, all of the furniture, the lamps, the dishes, literally down to the doorknobs, which they could strip out and use as scrap metal. The Soviets do what they do best, and they throw manpower at the situation, recognizing that this is the best of the terrible options that they have in front of them. They requisition items out of local homes and restock the palace. What they can't get that way, they take the contents of fabulous hotels in Moscow, like the Hotel Metropole, which you might be familiar with from Amor Towles, A Gentleman in Moscow. And they cart the contents of these hotels 1,000 miles south by train. And so the dishes and the maids' uniforms and the linens all have the distinctive Metropole M on them. What the Soviets are not quite as successful in is evicting some other residents who've moved in the meantime, this being bed bugs. They decide to give the palace a healthy dose of DDT to encourage them to make their way out, which we now realize was probably not the best idea. But of course, this cannot evict some of the other bugs that have moved in, that being the electronic variety that the Soviets have themselves installed in the private quarters of the Americans and the British, and of course, they'll be eavesdropping the entire time. And so I think that this photograph and this palace, it's very much symbolic of the Soviet Union at the time, where what you see on the surface is not necessarily indicative of that which lies just beneath. And it really takes an expert and someone who has experience in dealing with the Soviets to understand that what you see is not necessarily true of reality. So that gives a little bit more context behind this photograph that is so familiar. But the thing that I find most striking about this picture is comparing it with another that was taken just a few moments apart from a slightly different angle where you can see quite a different scene. Because off to the side, you can see two young women. This was Sarah Churchill, the 30-year-old daughter of Winston Churchill, and Kathleen Harriman, the 27-year-old daughter of the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, Averil Harriman. The third daughter, Anna Roosevelt, who's 38, FDR's daughter, is just outside the frame here, but you can see her on newsreel footage of the same scene. And when I saw this picture, a couple of questions came to mind. First, of all the people these world leaders could have brought with them to serve as their aides at this incredibly important moment on the precipice between World War and Cold War, what was so important and unique about the skills and abilities and experiences that their daughters had that made them the perfect partners to serve at their side in this incredibly charged meeting at the end of World War II? And secondly, and I think more importantly, we have a tendency to put these leaders on pedestals to the point that they become more than human, and it becomes very difficult to relate to them as you and I would relate to each other. But at the end of the day, they're also someone's dad. And what would it be to be their child and to be with them on the forefront of history? Before I introduce you to each of the daughters in turn, I want to introduce you to another young girl. This is me in 3rd grade. I think you could tell from an early age that I was historically inclined. I grew up in Winnetka, Illinois, just north of Chicago, a town some of you may be familiar with from the movies Home Alone or Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And we were really fortunate that we had a great opportunity to study local history. And of course, that's the history of the pioneers. I grew up loving Little House on the Prairie, and so I was thrilled when we had an opportunity to go and have a chance to live a pioneer day. We went to a pioneer school, made a pioneer meal. I got to wear a bonnet and a calico dress. I was in heaven, and it really also gave me an opportunity to have this, I think, quite formative experience of putting myself in the shoes of the people who came before me and imagining what would it have been like to have been a 3rd grader back in the time of the pioneers. And that really stayed with me. And I certainly won't pretend that this outfit didn't come out once in a while outside of this little field trip. I think it was my Halloween costume, too. I was really fortunate to grow up in a family that loved to read, very much inspired by my mom, who would read to us all the time. She was constantly reading aloud, whether it was before bed, on the porch in the summertime. We would read English children's classics, Little House, of course, Harry Potter, and my brother and sister and I would just love listening to our mom read aloud. And I think that sparked in me a really healthy imagination from the time I was a little girl and a desire to want to be a writer someday, much like Laura Ingalls grew up to be. I was also really fortunate to have a great relationship with my grandfather, who had served as an officer in the Navy during World War II. And from about the age of 7, I would chase him around on family holidays with a notepad, asking him to tell me stories about growing up in Montana during the Great Depression and then serving as an officer in the Navy during the war. And so I think it's, you can see that the trend there developing further. And these conversations with my grandfather, I think, were also somewhat in harmony with the movies that I loved to watch when I was little. My favorite movies were The Sound of Music and White Christmas and The Great Escape. And I loved these stories about World War II and the very palpable texture of the culture of the times that surrounded them. So I think it was a surprise to no one that when I got a little older and went to Harvard that I decided to become a history major. And this is me the morning that I turned in my senior thesis, inspired by my love of The Great Escape. And I had 125 books checked out from the library, which my roommate, who never went to the library, thought was hilarious, so we had to take a picture. I had my first opportunity to delve into the life of Winston Churchill as a historian through the process of writing a thesis on British prisoner of war escape narratives during World War II. And what I didn't realize was that Winston Churchill had written the first of what we think of as these grand tales of escape, very much modeled on Victorian adventure fiction, about his own escape from a POW camp during the Boer War in 1899 when he was just 24 years old. And it was the story of this thrilling escape that launched him to fame in Britain and really jump-started his political career. And it was the inspiration for many of the stories like The Great Escape that followed. I then had an opportunity to go to the place that is truly a historian's dream, that being Cambridge, where I got to do my master's looking at early modern counterintelligence practices. And for someone who loves history and wants to be immersed in this historical environment, especially where spies once ran all over the place during the Cold War, there really is no better place to be. And here, once again, I had this surprising opportunity to study Churchill, but again, not during the Second World War. The British government created a postal censorship program during World War I where they would read all the in- and outbound foreign mail in hopes of finding enemy German spies who might be in their midst. And this program of opening all the mail was overseen by Winston Churchill, who was then the Home Secretary. This caused a bit of a kerfuffle with the United States while we were still neutral because the right to privacy had emerged as a legal concept here in a way that it really had not in Britain. So you can see the seeds of my decision to then apply to law school. But at the time, I didn't know that how I wanted to incorporate history into my life going forward. I wanted to be a writer, but I thought it was something that maybe I'd turn to as a second career. And I didn't think I wanted to do a PhD and become a professor, so I decided to throw in my lot with many of my friends and give up the idyllic, beautiful Cambridge for this, which is just a little different. And I became a financial analyst in New York City, where, much to my amazement, coincidence intervened because in the lobby of my office was a bookstore called Chartwell Booksellers, which was named after Winston Churchill's country home. This is the only bookstore in America, and I think in the world, that specializes in books by and about Winston Churchill, the sort of thing you can only find in New York. And I was just drawn to the store, and I would go in there all the time, much to the amusement of the owner, who didn't have too many 24-year-old female financial analysts coming in to chat about Churchill. I would tell my colleagues on my desk I was going down to the lobby to get a coffee, but I was really just sneaking into the bookstore. And after a little while, I found out that there was a group called the International Churchill Society that was hosting a dinner across the street from my office at the Waldorf Hotel featuring Madeleine Albright as their keynote speaker. I'd long admired Secretary Albright, and I very much wanted to hear her talk, but I could not afford a price of the ticket at the time. And so I said to the owner, do you think that they need anyone to volunteer to check coats or show people to their table? And he said, let me put you in touch with them. I think they'd be happy just to have someone who is a young person excited about history join them. And sure enough, they were. The International Churchill Society is a group of scholars and academics, but also individuals of all different professions who are united in a desire to want to encourage people to study history and foreign policy and international relations and go into public service in the spirit of the leadership of Winston Churchill. I was very fortunate at the dinner also to meet a number of members of the Churchill family who were very involved in the organization. And it was right around that time that they were opening the papers of Winston's middle daughter, Sarah, to researchers for the first time. And the Churchill Society asked if I might be interested in writing an article about Sarah's papers. And I said yes, just thinking this would be a fun way to stay engaged with history, do a little writing. Meanwhile, I was applying to law school. But the other reason I was really excited about this was because I had had a little opportunity of sorts, I suppose you could say, from the time I was a little girl to have Sarah Churchill be a part of my life. My family has gone to the cloister at Sea Island in Georgia every summer since I was a baby, and on the wall there's this beautiful picture of Sarah Churchill on her wedding day. She'd eloped to Sea Island with her second husband in 1949, and every summer since I was literally tiny, from the beginning of the time I can remember, I used to walk past this picture and stop and think, what would it have been like to have been Sarah Churchill and to have my father be the prime minister? And here was my chance to find out. So if people know Sarah Churchill today, it's often that she had been an actress and a dancer. She starred in a movie with Fred Astaire in 1951 called Royal Wedding. But what I was really struck by as soon as I started reading her letters and papers and learning about her life was not her career as an actress, but her relationship with her father, especially from the time she was a very little girl. Winston and Sarah were very alike in their demeanor and their personality, and there was this closeness that existed between them, largely because of Sarah's connection with her dad coming from the hours that they would spend together in the garden outside their home, Chartwell in Kent, where Winston would be engaged in one of his favorite pastimes, which was bricklaying. He would be out there relaxing, laying these brick walls. Sarah would mix the cement, hand him the bricks, maintain the plumb line to make sure it didn't get all wiggly. And through these hours of laying bricks together, they would have these lovely conversations, also periods of contemplative silence. And through these hours, Sarah came to understand the way that her father's mind worked better than anyone, perhaps except for her mother. And she said that she could walk in silent step with him, where even if he wasn't speaking, she knew what he was thinking and could follow along. Being very much like him, she wanted to make her own way in the world on her own terms. But for a young woman of this era and her situation, there weren't too many ways to do that. Going to university wasn't something that she would have considered. She certainly wouldn't have imagined a career for herself in politics. But one thing that she thought she might do is that she could become an actress. Now, for some fathers, it might have been the most scandalous proposition, but Winston had been rather broken in by his own mother, who was the very scandalous American debutante Jenny Jerome, who wrote plays for London's West End, was rumored to have scores of lovers, and perhaps even a snake tattooed around her wrist, very taboo. And so just wanting to be an actress, by comparison, was rather tame. So Sarah did become an actress. Winston didn't put up too much of a fight. And very quickly, Sarah fell in love with the star of her show, a man named Vic Oliver, who was an Austrian citizen who was quite a bit older than she was and divorced. And the thing that concerned Winston most of all was the fact that he was an Austrian citizen because he could see the winds of change on the continent and was very concerned about what might happen to Sarah if she was married to someone who was Austrian. Sarah, however, was in love. She didn't heed any of her father's advice, so she ran off to New York and they eloped. But very quickly, unfortunately, the marriage broke down, and it coincided with the outbreak of World War II and Winston becoming prime minister. Sarah decided, as part of a way to recapture her independence, but also to do her bit for her country, she decided to join the women's branch of the Royal Air Force, where she became an aerial reconnaissance intelligence officer, looking at photographs that had been taken thousands of feet in the sky by recon pilots, and making intel assessments based on these pictures, looking at enemy harbors and determining the kinds of ships that were there based on the shadows that they cast in the water, or looking at fields that had been trampled and determining, was this an enemy troop movement or maybe just some cows that had been grazing in the pasture. One of my favorite stories about Winston and Sarah comes from her war work, where she decided to motorcycle home one weekend when she had leave, and she arrived just in time for dinner. And immediately she ran upstairs to see her papa, who was dressing for dinner and meticulously combing the 2 or 3 hairs that remained on top of his head. And he turns and says to her, at this very moment, go sailing towards the Mediterranean 542 ships. And she says, actually, Papa, I believe it's 543 ships. And he says, how do you know that? And she said, well, I've only been working on it for months. This was Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. And Winston says, well, why didn't you tell me? And Sarah said, I do believe there is such a thing as security. Winston was very charmed by her cheek and very proud of the work that she was doing, so immediately went downstairs to brag about her to that evening's guest of honor, who was none other than Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor was similarly charmed by the story, so she then went and told the press the next day. Sarah then arrived back at base on Monday and was immediately hauled in front of her superiors, who demanded to know who leaked this to the press, who told Mrs. Roosevelt. And Sarah could only say, I'm so sorry, but it was my father, the prime minister, and there was really nothing anyone could do. Early in the war, Winston and Clementine Churchill had decided that when he traveled abroad for meetings with his counterparts, that someone from the family should go with him as a protector and confidant. And Clementine herself was not keen to do this. She did not like to fly, even though she really was her husband's most trusted advisor. And so Sarah became a very natural option for him to turn to. As an actress, she actually had skills that were really well suited to diplomacy, of being able to deliver a subtle, nuanced message, to read between the lines, and report back on what she observed. She was in the military, so she understood the military imperatives of what was being discussed. She had this incredible connection with her father and an ability to read his mind, which would be so crucial at 2 o'clock in the morning when he could say exactly what he thought behind closed doors. And she was also a beautiful writer. Much like her father, she really had this lyrical voice and this power of observation, and she knew that when the war ended, that her father would want to write wartime memoirs, as he had done after World War I. And so Sarah's letters and observations behind the scenes of what was taking place outside the official negotiations that she wrote home to her mother would someday become part of her father's wartime memoirs. And so for all these reasons, she really was the perfect choice to accompany him. Sarah carried out her duties as a daughter diplomat with aplomb, and 2 other fathers took note of just how valuable a daughter diplomat could be from the first time that she went with him, which was to the Tehran Conference in 1943, the first meeting of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, where they laid the plans for D-Day. The first of these fathers was Averell Harriman, who was at the time one of the wealthiest men in America. He was the chairman of Union Pacific Railroad. He was the founder of Brown Brothers Harriman, owned Newsweek magazine, shipping conglomerates, manganese mines, you name it, he owned it. And he had 2 daughters, Mary and Kathleen, but he was not especially involved in their lives when they were little girls, as he was always off chasing business opportunities wherever that might lead him, including out to Sun Valley, which he created as the first American glamorous ski resort, which he created after Americans caught the ski craze from the Lake Placid Olympics, which he saw as a way to encourage people to take his trains out west. So he was always off chasing these business opportunities, and he became even more distant from his daughters after he and his wife divorced when they were about 10 years old. And he only really came back into their lives in a meaningful way when they were teenagers and their mother died. And he wrote to Mary and Kathleen and said to them, essentially, I know I can never be a warm and fuzzy father. That was not his nature. But he said to them that I do believe that we could become the best and finest of friends. He then made them a very interesting offer, which was quite unusual for a man of his situation at the time, and he offered them the opportunity to come and be part of his world of business to whatever extent it interested them. His older daughter, Mary, was not terribly interested, but his younger daughter, Kathleen, leapt at the chance. Much like her father, she was daring and adventurous. She was an incredible athlete. She was an expert equestrian, a crack shot, and she became a fabulous skier. She was so good that she was, in fact, the alternate for what then became the canceled 1940 Winter Olympics. She had this opportunity to be at her father's side, and she decided to take this in the form of working with him at Sun Valley, where she really served as his right-hand man, helping with publicity, checking on snow conditions, going and scouting out rival resorts that started popping up in the area, and even Sun Valley. At this point, Averell Harriman had left much of his world of business behind and had joined FDR's New Deal administration, largely at the urging of his older sister, Mary Harriman Rumsey, who, after Frances Perkins, was the highest-ranking woman in the New Deal administration. He had become very close friends with Harry Hopkins, who was FDR's very close confidant and advisor. And when the war broke out and the United States was still neutral, FDR wanted to create the Lend-Lease program to deliver aid to Britain without compromising neutrality, and he needed someone to go to London and oversee this program. Opportunity for my 23-year-old daughter to come with me in the middle of a blitz and become a war reporter. So off Kathy goes. She arrives in London just after the worst night of bombing of the Blitz, and she and her father become very close friends with Winston Churchill, his family, and inner circle. They were especially close with one Churchill, this being Pamela, the Prime Minister's 22-year-old daughter-in-law, who Kathy quickly sussed out was not quite all that she seemed. While lovely and fun, she was also having an affair with her father. Kathy realized that this could suit her rather well as well. She liked Pamela, they were very good friends, and she realized that if she became indispensable to her father by lending an air of respectability to all this time that they were spending with Pamela, that she probably wouldn't be sent home if things in London became more dangerous. But the connections with the Churchills really ran much deeper than that, and in fact, they were celebrating Kathy's 24th birthday all together on December 7th, 1941, when they all learned the news together about Pearl Harbor. When Averell Harriman became the ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1943, Kathy decided to continue her wartime adventure at her father's side, moved to Moscow, learned to speak Russian, and she really became the assistant ambassador to her father. And she, as the course of doing this, became the American woman who had more access to and experience with Stalin and his inner circle than any other American woman in history. With all the opportunities she had had to work with her father, she was very much a known quantity by all of the parties who were attending the Yalta Conference. And as she spoke Russian, she was the perfect person for him to take with to Yalta, to leave there with the advance teams and to coordinate between the Soviets and the Americans to make sure that no detail was left unattended. And she was able to do this as liaison between the two parties while he went off to Malta to meet with Churchill and Roosevelt. And she really was almost like a protocol officer at the State Department today, very much an unsung role where if things go wrong, you know who to point the finger at, but if things go right, the person who was such a success in that job is rarely noticed. However, Kathy's contributions were not unnoticed entirely, because this photograph of Kathy with this lovely horse is not just any old horse, but this was one that was actually gifted to her by Joseph Stalin himself. The third daughter who attended the Yalta Conference was Anna Roosevelt, and at 38, she was the oldest of the three daughters and also the only mother among them. She had 3 children. But I love this picture of Anna when she was a child with her father at Campobello Island, because it's one of the few that we have of FDR standing, which I think is quite striking. It's a lovely photo that really speaks to the closeness between them when she was a little girl. And they were very close very much because they had this shared passion for the environment and the natural world. He would take her with on long rides through their land in the Hudson River Valley, where he'd teach her about different species of flora and fauna. And she dreamed that someday she'd grow up to become the co-custodian of sorts with him of their home in Hyde Park in New York. But of course, all of this changed in an instant. No longer was he the sledding companion and horse riding companion that she had loved so much from her childhood when he was struck down by polio. And now suddenly this very active man was confined to a bed or a chair, and Anna found herself held at arm's length as all of a sudden doctors and nurses and political colleagues now surrounded him all the time, and she was very much pushed off to the side. She was sent away to school, which she hated, and then she was forced to become a debutante, which she detested even more, and couldn't understand why her very liberal-minded parents would insist on this for her when it was a system that they ridiculed so much for other people. She then went to Cornell, only very briefly, before leaving to make a rebellious marriage at age 20 to a man named Curtis Dahl. They had 2 children, but the marriage very quickly broke down. Anna, however, soon found love again, this time on the campaign trail of her father's first presidential campaign, where she fell in love with a Republican journalist named John Boettiger, who worked for one of his chief critics, William Randolph Hearst. And I love the love story of Anna and John meeting in this hotly debated, political environment where everyone is very polarized, because I think even in this day and age, it can prove that perhaps love still can conquer all. Anna and her husband moved out to Seattle, where they had another baby, and they became the editors of Hearst's Seattle Post-Intelligencer. However, when the war broke out and Anna's husband decided to do his bit and join the army, he shipped out to the Mediterranean, and Anna decided that rather than stay in Seattle, she would move home. And home, of course, meant the White House. She arrives just in time for Christmas in 1943, and quickly she realizes that something is not quite right about her father. He's sitting there with his mouth hanging open for long periods of time, almost as if he can't quite get enough oxygen. He's kind of staring off into space, losing his train of thought, scribbling at the end of lines. And it's little changes that you wouldn't necessarily notice if you were with him day in and day out, but Anna hadn't seen him in some time, and she became very concerned. He finally agreed to have a comprehensive medical examination in March of 1944, which revealed he was actually dying of congestive heart failure, for which there was no cure. Anna was sworn to secrecy. She could not tell anyone save her husband about the diagnosis. And interestingly, Eleanor Roosevelt really couldn't bring herself to terms with the idea that her husband was very ill, and just energy and willpower was not something that was going to fix this. Curiously, FDR himself never once asked what was wrong with him. Clearly, he knew something wasn't right, because Anna was now around him all the time, serving as his gatekeeper, making him eat things that were like what her 4-year-old son ate, making him rest as much as possible, if you can rest as a wartime president. She was very much the gatekeeper in the White House, helping to determine who really needed an audience with the president and who could be fobbed off on someone else. Sometimes she even went to such lengths to take papers out of his inbox at night and distribute them to others who she thought could handle them. Whether she should have been doing this or not, not sure about that, but she was singularly focused in ensuring that her father was going to make it to see the end of the war. Anna also became the guardian of his closest secret in this desire to prop him up as much as she could and give him any opportunity for rest and relaxation. There was a woman named Lucy Mercer who had been part of his life when Anna was a little girl. It was an affair that he'd had, which Eleanor had discovered, which really devastated her, and Anna remembered this time of Eleanor's great depression and sadness. And when Lucy came back into Franklin's life, and he approached Anna and said he had an old friend he hoped to see while Eleanor was out of town, Anna quickly realized who this was. But she decided to keep the secret anyway because she was so determined to do anything to help her father survive as long as he could to see the end of the war. Even though Roosevelt didn't know exactly what was wrong with him, he knew that Anna was protecting him and that at this point she was truly indispensable and he could not get along without her. So in January 1945, as he is looking at the preparations for the Yalta Conference, he cables his friend Winston Churchill and says, "If you're thinking of bringing your daughter Sarah to serve as your aide again at this conference, I'm thinking of bringing my daughter Anna." Anna finally has this opportunity to recapture the closeness that she remembered with her father from the time she was a little girl and be indispensable to him in the way that she always dreamed that she could. But she also knows that this is at a cost. This is at a cost of potentially betraying her mother, and she also knows that this is likely the last time that she'll ever have with her father to spend this time with him in this way before he passes away. I love this picture of the three daughters together because I think you can see a little bit of each of their unique personalities. You can see Sarah in her officer's uniform. You have Anna in the middle in this very sensible tweed, and Kathy in the end in a glamorous fur. And while they were all very much daughter diplomats, there were unique things about each of them that made them the perfect partners for their fathers at this moment in time. But what I think is unique about this role of daughter diplomat is that it's not one that's official, like someone from the State Department or for the Foreign Office, but they're there speaking with and carrying the presence of their fathers behind them. They're able to go out and have conversations in subtle, nuanced ways and deliver messages that someone more official might not be able to do. They're also able to go out into the local community and meet the people from the Soviet Union whose lives have been pretty summarily destroyed by the war and whose futures are being reordered by their fathers around the conference tables at that very moment, and come back and report to their fathers about what it's like to have interacted with the Soviet people in a way that's very different from dealing with Stalin and his inner circle and the Soviet bureaucratic machine. And it gives them a little bit of sense of hope in the future. And so the thing that I think is most important, though, about this picture is that I think in the realm of history, people often feel a bit intimidated by the study of history, especially the history of foreign policy or war or diplomacy, because it can feel very far removed from our lives. We don't know what it's like to negotiate across the table from Stalin, so how are we able to connect and to understand these people as human beings? And I think that seeing these people through the lens of also being part of a family is essential, and something that's also missing often in the study of some of these great figures and these great moments of history. Because just like us, their personal lives, their families, their hopes and dreams are all intertwined with the political, and the personal and the political go hand in hand always. And it's really impossible to separate them, as so often happens in the course of study of these great people and these great moments. I just want to conclude this afternoon with a few thoughts on what history can teach us about the present and how history and the present really are very much in communication all the time. I think there's a tendency to look back at historical events, especially like those around World War II, and see a direct correlation of here's an event and here's one lesson to be drawn from it. The classic example often being Munich in 1938. When you have an authoritarian who's on the rise, you have to stamp out the aggression before it is too late. But I think history is a little bit more fluid than that. And sometimes the things that we glean from history, we don't even realize that we can learn about that until something in our own time opens our eyes to things that we didn't see when talking about history before. Just like there have been so many books written about Churchill and Roosevelt, what else is there new to say about them? And I think it's surprising that you can still find quite a lot. One of the things that I thought about as I was writing this story was what is the appropriate role of the unelected family members of an elected official in their public duties? This is something that we hadn't thought about for a long time because presidents had very young children in the White House, but what about adult first children? And I think that this is part of that conversation about it's inevitable that you'll have private conversations with the people closest to you behind closed doors. How much is too much, and how much are those people truly your greatest advisors? Also really important, I think, is the absolute commitment that Churchill and Roosevelt had to meeting in person with Stalin. and Roosevelt's desire to found the United Nations as a forum where diplomats from around the world could gather together in person to expedite diplomacy, to iron out misunderstandings, and really have those kinds of conversations that can only be made face-to-face. Just like you saw with Biden's incredible trip to Kyiv recently to meet with Zelensky, even presidents still, and I was surprised by this, as I thought no security advance team would allow a president to make the kind of voyage that these leaders made in this day and age. But I think after all the time of COVID and being apart, it's just all the more important to appreciate and recognize how important it is to come together and see each other face to face. And finally, I can't help but think about the relationship between then and now as it relates to the war in Ukraine and the relationship between Russia and the West. I think from the time of FDR, there's long been this desire by American presidents to make a personal breakthrough with the Soviet or the Russian leader, where if only you can just rely on these powers of personal persuasion to make this connection, that all will be, if not well, will be able to make inroads to a much more harmonious future and iron out misunderstandings. However, I think that this has unfortunately gotten in the way sometimes in the relationship, because just as FDR was very disappointed that this desire to create a special bond like he had the special relationship with Churchill did not come to fruition with Stalin, no matter how much Stalin respected and admired him, which I do believe he did. You've seen subsequent American presidents be very disappointed in this attempt to build a personal bond, whether it's President Bush, Obama, Trump. I think it's finally proven out, unfortunately, over the last year, how little that actually plays a part in a Russian leader's desire to do what they do. And I think one of the most striking things that I found in the research while I was doing this book was a letter that was written by George Kennan to the Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius, who wrote a letter to him when he was then the number 2 in Moscow serving under Averell Harriman, of course would go on to become one of the wise men of the Cold War. And Stettinius, who'd been Secretary of State for 2 months, said, "Is there any information you can give me about the Soviet bureaucrats below Stalin that we'll be meeting with in hopes of finding common ground?" And Kennan said, "Unfortunately, I can't give you any of this information because what I have is probably fake. Their real biographies only come out in their obituaries when they're no longer of use to anyone. And don't be persuaded that invitations to dinner or rounds of golf can be the thing that makes a breakthrough in the relationship with the Soviet Union." And I think that those words are true today as much as they were then, as even after regime change, Soviets to Russians, and I think there are many continuities from the Tsarist era to the Soviet period to now. And so I think it's all the more important to not see some of these relationships in the personal way that we might with other world leaders, but to think about the cost and benefit analysis that foreign leaders make, even if they seem crazy to us. I don't think Putin's crazy. I think he's evil. But I think if you look at the history, there is a very clear calculation of what he's decided to do, and that there are definite lessons and insights to be gleaned from looking at the history of these relationships, not least at Yalta, but that's just one of many examples that is part of this much longer story of the relationship between East and West. So I will leave it there, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions if you have them. Thank you.
Any questions? Somebody have a question? Hang on just a second. We'll go back here.
Microphones going around, so if, whoever has the mic, if you wouldn't mind waiting for the mic to ask your question so it can be captured on the live stream.
Wow, well, I just have to say you're very impressive.
Oh, thank you.
We really enjoyed the information. Look forward to reading the book. And I'm curious about your personal goals, combining history, your love for international relationships, and the history of it. Are you looking to look at something like war crime prosecution down the road?
Potentially. I mean, as someone in law school now, thinking about past war crimes trials like Nuremberg or after Yugoslavia or Rwanda, whether someday when the Putin regime falls, if that will be the opportunity then to have, as part of their reconciliation on the world stage, an agreement to go through these war crimes trials, we'll see. Perhaps it's often kind of a rehabilitation mechanism, and if that's possible, maybe long in the future, sure. I see history and law as tools that can really be used hand in hand to think about complicated, often international facing problems that have very, very long histories. And so I am certainly planning on writing more books. I see myself first and foremost as a writer and historian. I will be going to work for Freshfields, a British law firm in Washington, D.C. In the fall, after I hopefully, knock on wood, pass the bar. But if there's a way to bring history and law together in a more direct way in the future, whether that's participating in diplomacy or foreign policy today, kind of along the lines of the things that I like to think about as a historian, I'd love to see if there are ways that I can contribute to that and have an opportunity to contribute to public service kind of through the combined lens of history and law. So we'll see. Yes.
Thank you. A great presentation. I'll take you back to what FDR agreed to do, which was to fly all that way when he was so terribly, terribly ill. If he had been better physically, do you think the decisions would have been different in any way?
That's one of those really tempting counterfactuals to think about, and one that I have certainly thought about. I've also thought about that in the context of if Truman had been president, if FDR had died by then, if the outcome would have been different. And while I definitely think there were some smaller concessions that might have been possible had Roosevelt been more forcefully aligned with Churchill in his negotiations with Stalin, and part of his exhaustion really manifested in his just unwillingness to meet with Churchill, because Churchill, for all of his good intentions, was quite exhausting. But unfortunately, he was. I think that at this point in the war, the Red Army was so firmly entrenched in Eastern Europe that for something to have been different, especially for Poland, would have really required the opening of the Western Front at least a year earlier. And to do that, both Britain and the United States would have had to have begun a process of rearmament significantly earlier, and then you're getting decisions that had been made in the 1930s. And so it is kind of this question of, where is the most direct link and kind of where it becomes too tenuous. And I just think that even if Roosevelt had been better, that the position of the Red Army was so entrenched that there was not much that anyone could do, no matter how sharp they were or how wily. It's just unless you're willing to start a war with the Soviets. Churchill had his generals draw up Operation Unthinkable to imagine that kind of prospect, but there was just no appetite for it at the time.
So thank you again. If you would like her book signed, please line up right here. And Catherine, thank you.
Thank you.